So as we all know, today is election day in Israel. So I thought that I'd say a few words about elections, not about, God forbid, who to vote for. But elections were unknown in Jewish life till really the beginning of the 20th century, really until the 1920s. The reasons for that, in the Talmud we find no provisions for any elections. The rule of the majority was only seen in judicial matters. The Sanhedrin decided, a Bet Din decided, but there was no political democracy with elections. The Torah doesn't provide for it. The Torah provides for a type of monarchy, really just an expanded constitutional monarchy that had checks and balances to it from the Kohanim and from the Nevi'im and from the people themselves. So in the modern world, elections did not become accepted until really the 18th and 19th centuries. And it took different forms. In the United States, for instance, there was originally there was no universal suffrage. Jefferson demanded that only people who owned property should have a right to vote. Women had no right to vote. And the system in England, where also had no universal suffrage. I think out of 40 million Englishmen, only about 600,000 had a right to vote at the beginning of the 20th century. So our concept of one man, one vote really didn't exist in the world. Now, Jews had no right to vote anywhere. First of all, in Russia, there were no votes in the Tsarist Empire. And then later, when the Tsar in 1905 granted permission for a Duma, for a parliament, and there was a limited amount of suffrage, and Jews were not included. Jews had no right to vote. So then it was only after the First World War, when you had the independent countries of Lithuania and Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine for a while, that the Jews had a right to vote. And then you had the formation of Jewish political parties. In other words, instead of being part of the general electoral system, there were nationalist parties, there were socialist parties. Instead of being part of that, the Jews ran their own parties, which really diminished any influence they could have had. But the Jewish political parties in the 1920s in Eastern Europe are the forerunners of all of the political parties that exist today in the state of Israel. So there was a very religious party, the Aguda, that ran in Poland and it ran in Lithuania and had great rabbonim that represented it. So Mayor Shapiro was a member of the Polish parliament, the founder of the Daf Yomi, and the Ponevezherov was a member of the Lithuanian parliament. But that was a Jewish party. So the only way the Jewish party could have any influence was in a system of proportional representation, which is the way we have it here in Israel today. So in proportional representation, you vote for the party, you don't vote for any individual who is running for the office. So therefore, proportional representation always creates the necessity for a coalition government, because it's almost impossible for one party to gain a majority on its own, because the proportional representation breaks up into a lot of small parties. And therefore you need a coalition government. So the religious party in Poland and in Lithuania, etc., in Eastern Europe, always had to make deals with the larger parties, the non-Jewish parties, and they were interested only in basically protecting Jewish life, allowing Jewish stores to be open on Sunday, and that trying to get an exemption to all sorts of laws that would be against Jewish society, etc. Now, in the 1920s, the Mizrahi also ran as a party in the general election in these countries, and they were the religious Zionists. The Zionists ran as a party, and it was very interesting that you run as a party in Poland on the platform that we're going to leave Poland, that Poland is not our home. And then there were Jewish socialist parties, and then there were Jewish communist parties. Now, they were all Jewish. They were not part of the general, let's say, the general socialist party that ran. And so that really was carried over here almost in toto. That all of these parties, they may take different names, but basically it's the same division that existed in the Jewish society in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. And because of that, therefore, it's a somewhat cumbersome and unwieldy situation because of the idea of proportional representation, which allows for the smaller parties to exist and have influence. So today in Israel, they raised the bar that in order to have any representation, you have to have a certain percentage of the vote. So therefore, the very small parties are eliminated, and they're forced to join with other parties to run that way. But again, you have a system where it's almost impossible to govern without a coalition, and coalition governments are always fragile, and they are subject to all sorts of political extortion, which is why we are privileged to have elections very often. I think in the history of the State of Israel, no parliament, no Knesset has ever lasted for the amount that it was elected. I think it's 5 years, and no one has ever lasted the 5 years, simply because the nature of the situation is that after a period of time it fractures. For personal reasons, for ideological reasons, for outside reasons, but it becomes impossible to maintain it. So we live in a time when democracy is exalted. As Churchill once said, it's the worst system of government, but it's better than any other one that's ever been invented. And there's a certain truth to that. In the United States, for instance, the checks and balances on democracy was encompassed in the Electoral College, which originally the people elected electors. These electors were supposed to be independent people. They were supposed to be the smartest, the best. And they would gather together and elect who should be president and the vice president. That was the original system. That's how Jefferson envisioned it. However, by the time that Jefferson was president, that no longer was how it worked. And therefore, the electors were bound to one of the political parties, and they would vote according to that political party. Originally, also in the United States, the person who had the most electoral votes was president. And the one who was next, the second in electoral votes, was elected vice president, which would completely be a difficult system, because it presumed that both of them would be above partisan interests and do what's best for the country, etc. So that fell apart right away. And you had the famous election between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, where each of them got the same amount of electoral votes, even though Jefferson won the popular vote by a considerable amount. And the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, where Jefferson prevailed. But again, it pointed out the imperfections of the system. So there is no perfect system, except in Beit Knesset Hanasi. There we never have problems in elections. But on a general scale, it doesn't seem to work that easily. And so I think, therefore, if we have that sort of historical perspective, etc., so in the long run of history, it really doesn't make that much of a difference as to what the absolute result is, because of the fact that it is always subject to revision and to compromise and to all sorts of other factors. So that's your lesson for today. And there will be an exam on this on Thursday. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash, Omer Tzagor Baruch Hu L'Zakos is Yisrael. Lefichach chirba lehem Torah mitzvah shenemar Adonai chavei tzman tzidko yagdil Torah v'yadir. Amen.